Declassified. August 15, 1944. The acrid smell of cordite hung thick in the humid Belgian air as Staff Sergeant Thomas McKenna crouched behind the twisted remains of what had once been a church bell tower. Sweat streamed down his face, cutting channels through the grime and dust that coated every exposed inch of skin. The thunderous roar of German artillery echoed across the valley below, each explosion sending tremors through the ancient stone beneath his boots. In the distance, orange flames licked at the darkening sky where the village of Malmedy burned, its population of 3,000 civilians trapped between advancing Wehrmacht forces and the Meuse River at their backs. McKenna's calloused hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the field telephone's wire connections, the familiar weight of his electrician's tools feeling foreign in this hellish landscape. The temperature had climbed to 92 degrees Fahrenheit, unusual for Belgium in mid-August, and the oppressive heat seemed to amplify every sound, every smell, every desperate prayer whispered by the men around him. Through his binoculars, he could see the German forces methodically advancing through the wheat fields below, their field-gray uniforms moving like a plague of locusts across the golden landscape. Panzer IV tanks rolled forward in perfect formation, their tracks churning the earth into bloody mud where Allied defenders had made their final stands just hours before. The morning had begun with such promise. Intelligence reports suggested the German retreat was accelerating, that the Wehrmacht's 7th Army was in full disarray following the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. General Bradley's forces had been pushing hard since Operation Cobra, and every indicator suggested the Germans were finally breaking. But those reports had been catastrophically wrong. Instead of a retreating army in chaos, McKenna now watched as nearly 4,000 veteran Wehrmacht soldiers, supported by 37 tanks and self-propelled guns, executed what could only be described as a tactical masterpiece. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled through the radio, barely audible above the constant thunder of German guns. All units, this is Overwatch. Enemy force strength confirmed at battalion level with armored support. Civilian evacuation routes compromised. Repeat, evacuation routes compromised. The words hit McKenna like physical blows. 3,000 men, women, and children huddled in basements and bomb shelters throughout Malmedy, their only escape routes now controlled by an enemy that had shown little mercy to civilians in previous encounters. McKenna wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, tasting salt and desperation. How had it come to this? 6 weeks ago, they had been celebrating the liberation of Paris. The war in Europe seemed to be winding down, victory finally within reach after 5 long years of grinding combat. Now, watching German mortars systematically target every building that might shelter civilians, McKenna wondered if they were witnessing the beginning of a new phase of horror. The Wehrmacht commander below wasn't just occupying territory, he was methodically eliminating any possibility of civilian survival. Lieutenant Morrison crawled up beside McKenna, his young face pale with exhaustion and terror. "Sergeant, the colonel wants to know if there's any way to get communications to the artillery units on Hill 317. If we can't call in fire support, those people down there are dead." Morrison's voice cracked on the last word, betraying his 22 years despite his attempts at military bearing. McKenna studied the lieutenant's face, seeing his own fears reflected there. They all knew the mathematics of their situation. 4th Infantry Division had 3 companies of worn-down GIs facing a reinforced German battle group. Without artillery support, without air cover, without any avenue for civilian evacuation, they were about to witness a massacre. But as McKenna stared at the tangled mess of communication wires scattered around the ruined bell tower, something stirred in the back of his mind. A memory from another life, another world. Before the olive-drab uniforms and the weight of an M1 Garand, he had been Thomas McKenna of Local 3 Electrical Workers Union, the man who could wire a 40-story building in Manhattan or troubleshoot the most complex electrical systems when everyone else had given up. His father, Sean McKenna, had taught him that every electrical problem had a solution if you understood the fundamental principles of current flow and resistance. The German artillery barrage was intensifying now, the enemy commander clearly preparing for his final assault. McKenna could see the pattern forming below, the methodical way the Wehrmacht forces were positioning themselves for maximum psychological impact on the trapped civilians. This wasn't just military strategy, it was calculated terror designed to break the spirit of anyone who witnessed it. In 6 hours, when the sun set behind the hills to the west, those 3,000 souls would face a choice between surrender and annihilation. Through his binoculars, McKenna watched a German signals officer directing the placement of field telephone lines along the enemy's forward positions. The man moved with the precision of someone who understood his craft, carefully routing cables to avoid potential Allied fire while maintaining redundancy in his communications network. It was professional work, the kind McKenna himself might have admired under different circumstances. But as he watched, a wild idea began to form in his mind. An idea so audacious, so technically improbable, that his rational mind immediately rejected it. Yet the idea persisted, growing stronger as McKenna studied the German positions through his field glasses. What if the very technology the Germans were using to coordinate their attack could be turned against them? What if someone with the right knowledge, the right skills, and perhaps the right amount of desperate courage could transform their greatest strength into their most vulnerable weakness? The other soldiers around him saw only an impossible military situation. McKenna saw something different. He saw an electrical engineering problem that might, just might, have a solution nobody had considered. As another German shell exploded barely 50 yards away, showering the bell tower with fragments of ancient stone, McKenna made a decision that would echo through military history. He was going to attempt something that every manual said was impossible, something that violated basic principles of military communication security, something so technically challenging that even his old foreman back in New York would have called him crazy. But if it worked, if this insane gamble somehow succeeded, those 3,000 civilians might live to see another sunrise. The stage was set for an innovation that would change everything. In the next 24 hours, Thomas McKenna would prove that sometimes the most sophisticated military problems required the simplest solutions, and that an electrician's understanding of basic circuitry could overcome the most advanced tactical planning. The German commander below had no idea that his perfectly orchestrated assault was about to be undone by what McKenna would later describe as nothing more than a crazy wire trick learned on construction sites across Depression-era America. The global war situation in August 1944 presented a complex tapestry of Allied advances and German desperation that made the battle for Malmedy both inevitable and critically important. Following the successful D-Day landings on June 6 and the subsequent breakout from the Normandy hedgerows during Operation Cobra in late July, Allied forces had achieved significant momentum across the Western Front. General Omar Bradley's First Army and General George S. Patton's newly operational Third Army were racing across France, liberating towns and cities at a pace that seemed to suggest German resistance was finally crumbling after 5 years of total warfare. Yet this apparent success masked a more complex military reality. The German army, while retreating, had not collapsed entirely. Veteran Wehrmacht units, many commanded by officers with extensive Eastern Front experience, were conducting fighting withdrawals that maximized Allied casualties while preserving their own core strength. The battle for Malmedy represented one of these calculated stands, where German forces chose to make costly Allied advances while simultaneously demonstrating to occupied populations that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Thomas Francis McKenna had never intended to become a soldier, let alone find himself crouched in a Belgian bell tower contemplating electrical engineering solutions to military problems. Born in 1918 in Queens, New York, to Irish immigrant parents, McKenna grew up in a household where practical skills were valued above academic achievements. His father, Sean McKenna, had arrived from County Cork in 1902 with nothing but a strong back and an intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems functioned. By 1920, Sean had established himself as one of New York's most reliable electrical contractors, building a reputation for solving problems that left other electricians scratching their heads. Young Thomas spent his childhood summers working alongside his father on construction sites throughout Manhattan and Brooklyn, learning that every electrical system, no matter how complex, operated according to fundamental principles that could be understood and manipulated. Sean McKenna taught his son that electricity followed predictable paths, that current always sought the route of least resistance, and that understanding these principles could solve seemingly impossible problems. "Electricity doesn't lie, Tommy," Sean would say while troubleshooting a particularly difficult installation. "If you understand what it wants to do, you can make it do what you need it to do." After graduating from Queens Vocational High School in 1936, Thomas joined Local 3 of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, following his father into the union that had provided stability for their family throughout the worst years of the Great Depression. The work was demanding and often dangerous, requiring electricians to wire skyscrapers, subway tunnels, and industrial facilities under conditions that tested both technical skill and physical courage. McKenna excelled at the most challenging assignments, developing a reputation for finding solutions when standard approaches failed. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed everything. Like millions of young American men, McKenna felt the call to serve his country, but his decision to enlist was complicated by his status as an essential worker in war-critical industries. New York's electrical infrastructure was vital to the war effort, and skilled electricians were desperately needed to maintain defense plants and shipyards. For months, McKenna struggled with the choice between patriotic duty and professional responsibility, watching as neighborhood friends shipped out to training camps while he continued wiring aircraft manufacturing facilities in Long Island. The decision finally came in March 1942, when McKenna's younger brother Patrick was killed aboard the USS Yorktown during the Doolittle raid. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday evening while Thomas was troubleshooting a complex lighting system in a Brooklyn Navy Yard facility. The words seemed to burn themselves into his memory. "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your son, Seaman First Class Patrick Joseph McKenna, was killed in action in the service of his country." That night, Thomas walked the familiar streets of his Queens neighborhood for hours, seeing Patrick's face in every storefront window, hearing his voice in every conversation drifting from corner bars and late-night diners. 3 days later, Thomas McKenna walked into the Army recruiting station in downtown Manhattan and enlisted as a private in the infantry. He was 24 years old, possessed skills that could have kept him safely employed throughout the war, and had every reason to avoid the dangers of combat service. But Patrick's death had crystallized something in Thomas's mind. The war was no longer an abstract concept happening in distant countries, it had become personal, immediate, and unavoidable. Basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, proved more challenging than McKenna had anticipated. The physical demands were manageable for someone accustomed to construction work, but the military's emphasis on unquestioning obedience conflicted with his civilian experience of solving problems through independent analysis and creative thinking. Drill sergeants expected instant compliance with orders, while McKenna's instincts led him to analyze problems and propose alternative solutions. This clash of philosophies resulted in numerous disciplinary actions and extra-duty assignments that nearly resulted in his discharge from the service. The turning point came during advanced individual training, when McKenna's company encountered a seemingly impossible communications exercise. The scenario required establishing telephone connections between command posts separated by several miles of Georgia swampland, using equipment that had been deliberately sabotaged to simulate battle damage. Standard procedures called for replacing damaged equipment with spare components, but the exercise specifically prohibited access to repair parts. Most soldiers accepted the impossibility of the situation and waited for further instructions. McKenna approached the problem differently. Drawing on his electrical background, he analyzed the damaged equipment to understand exactly what functions had been compromised and what components might be improvised or bypassed entirely. Working through the night with materials scavenged from other training equipment, he created a communications network that not only met the exercise requirements but actually improved upon the reliability of the standard configuration. His solution involved principles of electrical engineering that were completely unfamiliar to his fellow soldiers but represented basic problem-solving techniques for anyone with his background. Captain Robert Hendricks, the officer overseeing the exercise, had never seen anything like McKenna's improvised communications system. A West Point graduate with extensive theoretical knowledge but limited practical experience, Hendricks initially suspected that McKenna had somehow cheated or violated exercise rules. Only after extensive testing and explanation did Hendricks begin to understand that McKenna possessed a unique combination of technical knowledge and creative problem-solving ability that could prove invaluable in combat situations where standard procedures might prove inadequate. This incident marked the beginning of a mentor relationship that would shape McKenna's military career. Captain Hendricks recognized that McKenna's civilian skills represented a resource that could be developed and utilized rather than suppressed. Under Hendricks' guidance, McKenna learned to channel his technical expertise within military frameworks, finding ways to contribute innovative solutions while maintaining proper military discipline and chain of command protocols. Following infantry training, McKenna was assigned to the 4th Infantry Division's Communications Section, where his electrical background made him invaluable for maintaining and repairing the complex radio and telephone equipment that formed the backbone of modern military operations. The division was preparing for deployment to England as part of the massive buildup preceding the planned invasion of continental Europe. McKenna spent months in training exercises throughout the English countryside, learning how theoretical technical knowledge translated into practical battlefield applications under conditions of stress, fatigue, and enemy action. The reality of combat first hit McKenna during the 4th Infantry Division's assault on Utah Beach on June 6, 1944. Everything he had learned about electricity, about problem-solving, about technical innovation, seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of machine gun fire and artillery explosions. The careful theoretical knowledge that had made him valuable during training exercises became secondary to basic survival instincts as German defenders attempted to drive the Allied invasion back into the English Channel. Yet even during those first terrifying hours of combat, McKenna found himself automatically analyzing problems from a technical perspective, noticing how German defensive positions were laid out, how their communication systems functioned, how their tactical coordination depended on reliable information flow. As the 4th Infantry Division pushed inland from Utah Beach and participated in the grinding battle for the Normandy hedgerows, McKenna's technical skills proved increasingly valuable. The Bocage country of northern France, with its ancient fieldstone walls and dense hedgerows, created a nightmare for military communications. Standard radio procedures often failed due to terrain interference, while telephone lines were constantly cut by artillery fire or damaged by the movement of tanks and heavy equipment. McKenna's ability to improvise repairs and devise alternative communication methods kept his unit connected to higher headquarters when other units found themselves operating in complete isolation. The liberation of Cherbourg in late June and the subsequent breakout from the Normandy pocket during Operation Cobra in July had filled McKenna and his fellow soldiers with optimism that the war in Europe might end before Christmas. German resistance seemed to be crumbling, with entire units surrendering rather than fight to the death. The rapid advance across France during August reinforced this optimism, as Allied forces liberated town after town with minimal resistance. It was this context of apparent German collapse that made the situation at Malmedy so shocking and unexpected. The impossible problem facing Allied forces at Malmedy on August 15, 1944, represented everything that could go wrong with military planning when assumptions about enemy capabilities proved catastrophically incorrect. The rolling hills surrounding the Belgian town created a natural amphitheater that channeled movement along predictable routes while providing excellent observation positions for defenders. Morning mist clung to the valley floor, reducing visibility to less than 200 yards and negating any advantage Allied forces might have gained from superior numbers or equipment positioning. The German force that had occupied Malmedy overnight was not the demoralized, retreating remnant that Allied intelligence had predicted. Instead, Kampfgruppe Weber, named for its commander Oberst Heinrich Weber, consisted of veteran troops from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, reinforced with elements from the 116th Panzer Division and supported by the 394th Artillery Battalion. These were experienced soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front, men who understood urban warfare and had developed tactics specifically designed to maximize civilian casualties while minimizing their own losses. Oberst Weber had positioned his forces with the tactical skill of someone who had survived 3 years of combat against Soviet forces. The German defensive positions formed interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach to Malmedy, while their artillery was pre-registered on likely Allied assembly areas and communication positions. More importantly, Weber had positioned his forces to use the civilian population as both human shields and psychological weapons against Allied attackers. Every German strongpoint was located near civilian shelters, making Allied artillery support impossible without accepting massive civilian casualties. The Wehrmacht's tactical deployment around Malmedy demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both terrain and Allied operational patterns. Weber had studied how American forces approached urban combat situations and had positioned his defenses to exploit predictable Allied responses. He knew that American commanders would be reluctant to use overwhelming firepower in areas with significant civilian populations, and he had structured his entire defensive scheme around this ethical constraint. German machine gun positions were located in schools and hospitals, while artillery observers operated from church towers and residential buildings where civilian families had taken shelter. Previous Allied attempts to dislodge German forces from similar positions had resulted in tactical disasters that haunted military planners throughout the European theater. The battle for Villers-Bocage in June had cost the British 7th Armoured Division nearly 200 vehicles and over 1,000 casualties when German defenders used urban terrain to neutralize Allied advantages in numbers and firepower. The assault on Caen had required weeks of preparatory bombardment that reduced the city to rubble while causing thousands of civilian casualties, yet German defenders had continued fighting from the ruins until the position became completely untenable. Colonel James Harrison, commanding the 4th Infantry Division's 2nd Brigade combat team, faced a tactical problem that seemed to have no acceptable solution. Direct assault would result in catastrophic casualties among his already depleted forces, while the use of artillery or air support would inevitably kill hundreds of innocent civilians. Flanking maneuvers were impossible due to the terrain and the limited time available before German reinforcements arrived. Intelligence reports suggested that additional Wehrmacht units were moving toward Malmedy from both the north and east, meaning that any delay in resolving the current situation would only make it worse. The communication challenges facing Harrison's forces compounded every other aspect of the tactical problem. Standard radio frequencies were being jammed by German electronic warfare equipment, while telephone lines to higher headquarters had been cut by artillery fire during the initial German assault. This isolation meant that Harrison could not request additional support, could not coordinate with adjacent units, and could not even inform division headquarters about the true scope of the crisis developing at Malmedy. McKenna had spent 3 days observing German positions through binoculars and field glasses, taking careful notes about their communication procedures, their patrol patterns, and the way they coordinated artillery fire with ground movements. What he noticed was both impressive and troubling. The German defenders operated with a level of tactical coordination that suggested excellent internal communications and well-trained leadership. They responded to threats quickly and effectively, shifting defensive fires with precision that indicated real-time information sharing between observation posts and weapons positions. But McKenna's electrical background led him to notice something that pure military observers might miss. The German communication system, while tactically effective, appeared to rely heavily on field telephone networks rather than radio communications. This made sense from a military perspective, as telephone communications were more secure and less subject to electronic jamming than radio transmissions. However, it also created potential vulnerabilities that might be exploited by someone who understood how field telephone systems functioned. German field telephone equipment in 1944 represented sophisticated engineering designed to provide reliable communications under combat conditions. The standard Wehrmacht field telephone, designated as the FF-33, operated on principles similar to civilian telephone networks but incorporated additional security features and enhanced durability for military use. Multiple telephone circuits could be established using different wire pairs within the same cable, allowing commanders to maintain separate communication channels for different purposes while minimizing the amount of cable that needed to be strung between positions. McKenna's analysis of German communication patterns revealed several important details about how their system functioned. First, the Germans appeared to be using a centralized switching system that routed all communications through a single command post located somewhere in the center of their defensive perimeter. Second, their telephone network showed signs of redundancy, with multiple cable routes connecting critical positions to provide backup communications if primary circuits were damaged by Allied fire. Third, The timing of German responses to tactical situations suggested that their communication system was highly effective, with minimal delays between observation of Allied movements and coordinated defensive responses. Expert military opinion: when McKenna tentatively raised the possibility of somehow disrupting German communications, was uniformly dismissive. Signal Corps officers pointed out that German field telephone equipment was specifically designed to resist tampering or sabotage. The cables were heavily insulated and often buried or otherwise protected from easy access. Even if someone could physically reach German telephone lines, standard military doctrine held that cutting communications cables would only result in temporary disruption before repairs restored service or backup systems were activated. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison, the division's chief signals officer, explained to McKenna why communication sabotage was considered ineffective against competent military forces. "Son, the Germans aren't amateurs. Their signal troops know their business as well as ours do. Cut one wire, and they've got backup circuits running within minutes. Cut all their wires, and they switch to radio or messenger systems. You can't win a battle by playing with telephone lines." Morrison's assessment reflected conventional military wisdom based on extensive combat experience and theoretical understanding of communication warfare. Captain Hendricks, now serving as Harrison's operations officer, was more receptive to McKenna's ideas but equally skeptical about their practical application. Hendricks had observed McKenna's technical abilities during training in combat operations, but he understood that individual innovation, no matter how clever, could not overcome fundamental military realities. The German force at Malmedy represented a significant military challenge that required conventional solutions, superior firepower, tactical maneuver, or overwhelming numerical advantage. Technical tricks might be useful for solving specific problems, but they could not substitute for proper military force applied effectively. Even McKenna himself initially doubted whether his growing understanding of German communication vulnerabilities could translate into any practical advantage for Allied forces. The theoretical possibility of disrupting enemy communications was very different from actually accomplishing such disruption under combat conditions while avoiding German security measures and defensive precautions. The distance between observation positions and German telephone installations meant that any sabotage attempt would require penetrating enemy defensive lines, a mission that seemed suicidal for a single soldier regardless of his technical expertise. But as McKenna continued studying German positions and communication patterns, he began to notice something that contradicted everything he had been taught about military communication security. The Wehrmacht defenders at Malmedy, despite their tactical sophistication and operational effectiveness, appeared to be using their field telephone network in ways that created unexpected vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities were not obvious to military observers but would be immediately apparent to anyone with extensive experience in civilian electrical systems. The innovation that would ultimately save 3,000 civilian lives began with McKenna's observation that German field telephone circuits shared certain fundamental characteristics with the electrical power distribution systems he had worked on throughout New York City. Both types of systems relied on copper conductors to carry electrical signals across significant distances, both used similar insulation and protection methods, and both were vulnerable to the same kinds of electrical phenomena that McKenna had learned to understand and manipulate during his civilian career. German field telephone networks in 1944 operated using what electrical engineers called a party line configuration, where multiple telephone instruments shared the same wire pair by using different electrical characteristics to distinguish between individual circuits. This system allowed German signal troops to establish complex communication networks using minimal amounts of cable while maintaining reasonable security through careful frequency management and circuit isolation. However, this same efficiency created opportunities for someone who understood how to manipulate electrical signals within shared conductor systems. The first component of McKenna's innovation involved recognizing that German telephone circuits, like all electrical systems, operated according to predictable laws of physics that could be exploited through precise manipulation of voltage, current, and impedance characteristics. Every field telephone circuit required specific electrical conditions to function properly, and these conditions could be disrupted by introducing carefully calculated interference patterns that would degrade signal quality without immediately revealing the source of the problem. McKenna's civilian experience with complex electrical troubleshooting had taught him how to trace signal paths through multi-conductor cable systems, identify connection points where different circuits intersected, and understand how electrical interference propagated through shared conductor networks. These skills, developed over years of working on Manhattan skyscraper electrical systems, translated directly to analyzing military telephone networks that operated on similar principles despite their different applications and security requirements. The second component involved understanding how military communication protocols could be turned against themselves through careful manipulation of signal characteristics. German field telephone procedures relied on specific audio quality standards and signal strength requirements that enabled operators to distinguish between legitimate communications and interference caused by equipment malfunction or battle damage. However, these same quality standards could be exploited by someone who understood how to create artificial interference patterns that mimicked legitimate system behavior while actually disrupting communication effectiveness. McKenna realized that he could create what electrical engineers called phantom circuits within the German telephone network by carefully manipulating the electrical relationships between different wire pairs in their field telephone cables. Phantom circuits use the electrical characteristics of existing conductors to create additional communication channels without requiring separate physical wires. The technique was commonly used in civilian telephone systems to maximize circuit capacity, but McKenna saw how the same principles could be applied in reverse to create systematic interference that would degrade German communication effectiveness. The third element of McKenna's innovation required understanding how the German centralized communication system created a single point of failure that could be exploited through precise electrical manipulation. The Wehrmacht's reliance on a central switching system meant that all communication circuits eventually connected to a single location where signals were processed and routed to their final destinations. This centralization provided efficiency and security advantages but also created an opportunity for someone who could access the central switching point and introduce carefully designed electrical interference. McKenna's plan involved using his knowledge of electrical circuit analysis to identify the exact location of the German central switching system by analyzing the electrical characteristics of their field telephone network. Every electrical circuit created a unique signature of voltage, current, and impedance characteristics that could be measured and analyzed by someone with the proper equipment and knowledge. By carefully measuring these characteristics at different points along accessible German telephone lines, McKenna believed he could triangulate the location of their central switching system with sufficient accuracy to target it for sabotage. The materials required for McKenna's innovation were surprisingly simple and readily available from standard military equipment and supplies. The primary component was a portable field telephone test set, designated as the TS-6, which was part of standard signal core equipment and contained meters capable of measuring voltage, current, and line resistance with sufficient precision for McKenna's analysis requirements. Additional components included standard electrical wire, insulation materials, and basic electrical tools that were available from engineering supplies or could be improvised from other equipment. McKenna's testing process began with careful analysis of German communication patterns during different periods of tactical activity. He discovered that German telephone usage followed predictable patterns that correlated with their operational schedules, patrol activities, and command conferences. By mapping these communication patterns against known German tactical procedures, McKenna could identify periods when the central switching system would be handling maximum traffic and therefore most vulnerable to systematic interference. The secret testing phase required McKenna to develop techniques for accessing German telephone circuits without detection while gathering the electrical measurements necessary for his analysis. This involved nighttime reconnaissance missions into areas between Allied and German positions, where damaged telephone equipment and abandoned cable installations provided opportunities to study German electrical systems without directly penetrating enemy defensive lines. These missions were extremely dangerous, as German patrols regularly swept areas between the lines to prevent exactly this type of intelligence gathering. Each test run provided additional data about German electrical systems and allowed McKenna to refine his understanding of how their communication network functioned. He discovered that German field telephone circuits operated at slightly different voltage levels than American equipment, used different impedance matching techniques, and incorporated security features that could be identified through careful electrical analysis. More importantly, he identified specific vulnerabilities in the German switching system that could be exploited through precise electrical manipulation. The refinements made after each test gradually shaped McKenna's plan into a workable sabotage operation that could be executed by a single person with minimal equipment while offering reasonable prospects for success. The final plan involved 3 phases of electrical manipulation designed to create cascading failures throughout the German communication network without immediately revealing the artificial nature of the interference. The timing and sequence of these manipulations would be critical, as German signal troops would quickly investigate any obvious communication problems and might discover evidence of sabotage if McKenna's work was not sufficiently subtle. Captain Hendricks was initially skeptical when McKenna presented his detailed analysis of German communication vulnerabilities and proposed sabotage techniques. The plan seemed to depend on too many theoretical assumptions and required McKenna to operate alone behind enemy lines for an extended period while performing precise technical work under combat conditions. However, McKenna's mathematical calculations and electrical engineering analysis were sufficiently detailed and technically sound to warrant serious consideration, especially given the desperate nature of their tactical situation. The final preparations for McKenna's operation required careful coordination with Allied forces to ensure that his communication sabotage efforts would be properly supported by conventional military action. Colonel Harrison's tactical plan called for a coordinated assault on German positions to begin exactly 2 hours after McKenna confirmed that he had successfully disrupted enemy communications. This timing would maximize the confusion created by German communication failures while giving McKenna sufficient time to complete his work and withdraw to Allied lines before the main assault began. The execution of McKenna's crazy wire trick began at 0347 hours on August 16, 1944, under a new moon that provided the darkness necessary for his approach to German positions while leaving enough ambient light for the precise technical work his plan required. The temperature had dropped to 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the night, creating ground fog that provided additional concealment but also made movement more difficult and increased the risk of accidentally contacting German security patrols. McKenna carried minimal equipment, his TS-6 test set, basic electrical tools, wire and insulation materials, and emergency rations for a mission that might require up to 12 hours to complete. The German force dispositions around Malmedy had not changed significantly during the night, but McKenna's careful observation revealed subtle shifts in patrol patterns and communication activity that suggested Oberst Weber was preparing for either a major assault on Allied positions or a withdrawal to more defensible terrain. Intelligence reports received after midnight indicated that additional Wehrmacht units were moving toward Malmedy from the northeast, meaning that any delay in resolving the current tactical situation would result in significantly stronger German forces and correspondingly reduced prospects for civilian survival. The Allied tactical situation had deteriorated during the night as well. 4th Infantry Division's casualty reports showed that Harrison's brigade was operating at approximately 60% strength, with several companies reduced to platoon size due to losses sustained during previous engagements. Ammunition supplies were running low, particularly for the heavy weapon systems that would be essential for any direct assault on German positions. Medical supplies were critically short, meaning that casualties from any major engagement would overwhelm available treatment capabilities. McKenna's approach to the German communication lines required traversing approximately 800 yards of contested terrain that was periodically swept by German machine gun fire and illuminated by randomly fired flares designed to detect Allied infiltration attempts. His route followed a drainage ditch that provided concealment but also channeled movement along a predictable path that German defenders might have targeted for defensive fires. Progress was necessarily slow, with frequent stops to avoid detection by German listening posts and security patrols that operated throughout the area between opposing forces. The critical phase of McKenna's mission began when he reached the abandoned farmhouse where German communication cables converged before routing to their central switching position. Previous reconnaissance had identified this location as the optimal access point for his electrical analysis work, as multiple cable runs were easily accessible and the building's basement provided concealment for the extended technical work his plan required. However, reaching this position required crossing 50 yards of completely open ground that was clearly visible from German observation posts. McKenna waited until 0523 hours, when German communication traffic indicated that their command post was conducting what appeared to be a scheduled conference or briefing session that would occupy the attention of their senior leadership and reduce the likelihood of security patrols in his immediate area. His movement across the open ground required exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, during which he was completely vulnerable to German observation and defensive fires. The experience of crossing that open space while carrying sensitive electronic equipment represented the longest 4 minutes of McKenna's life. Once inside the farmhouse basement, McKenna began the precise electrical analysis work that would determine whether his theoretical understanding of German communication vulnerabilities could translate into practical sabotage capabilities. The TS-6 test set proved capable of measuring the electrical characteristics of German telephone circuits with sufficient precision to confirm McKenna's earlier calculations and identify the specific vulnerabilities he had predicted. More importantly, his measurements revealed that the German central switching system was located exactly where his analysis had predicted, approximately 400 yards southeast of his current position. The first phase of McKenna's sabotage operation involved introducing carefully calculated electrical interference into what he had identified as the primary command communication circuit connecting the German central switching system with Oberst Weber's forward command post. This interference was designed to create intermittent signal degradation that would appear to result from equipment malfunction or battle damage rather than deliberate sabotage. The technique required precise manipulation of circuit impedance characteristics using improvised electrical components connected to specific points within the German cable installation. McKenna's electrical modifications took nearly 2 hours to complete, requiring him to identify specific wire pairs within the German cable, calculate precise resistance and capacitance values for his interference devices, and install these components in ways that would not be immediately obvious to German signal troops conducting routine maintenance or troubleshooting activities. The work required the steady hands and technical precision of someone with extensive civilian electrical experience, as even minor errors in component values or installation techniques would either render the sabotage ineffective or reveal its artificial nature to German investigators. The immediate effects of McKenna's first-phase interference became apparent within minutes of installation, as German communication traffic patterns showed clear signs of degraded signal quality and increased message repetition requests. German telephone operators were experiencing intermittent audio distortion and signal strength variations that interfered with clear communication but did not completely prevent message transmission. This created exactly the type of gradual system degradation that McKenna had predicted would cause maximum confusion while minimizing the likelihood of immediate countermeasures. German reaction to these communication problems followed predictable military procedures for troubleshooting equipment malfunctions under field conditions. Signal troops began systematic testing of their telephone equipment and cable installations, focusing initially on obvious potential failure points such as external cable damage or equipment component failures. This troubleshooting process consumed significant German manpower and attention while failing to identify the true source of their communication problems, exactly as McKenna had predicted based on his understanding of standard troubleshooting procedures. The second phase of McKenna's operation required him to relocate to a different access point where he could target what his analysis had identified as the secondary command circuit connecting the central switching system with German artillery observers and weapons positions. This circuit was more heavily protected and technically more sophisticated than the primary command network, but McKenna's electrical analysis had revealed specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited using more advanced interference techniques developed from his civilian experience with complex electrical systems. Installing the second-phase interference devices required McKenna to penetrate closer to German defensive positions, increasing his risk of detection while performing even more precise technical work under increasingly dangerous conditions. The German troubleshooting efforts triggered by his first-phase interference had increased security patrol activity throughout the communication cable routes, meaning that McKenna had to move more carefully while working faster to avoid detection. The technical requirements of his second-phase work also demanded greater precision, as the electrical calculations involved more complex impedance matching and signal manipulation techniques. The cascading effects of McKenna's two-phase electrical sabotage began to overwhelm German communication capabilities exactly as his analysis had predicted. The combination of primary command circuit degradation and secondary network interference created a situation where German units could maintain basic communication but could not coordinate complex tactical activities with the precision required for effective urban combat operations. Artillery fire missions were delayed or misdirected due to communication failures between observers and firing positions, while infantry movements lacked the tight coordination that had made German defensive tactics so effective. The critical moment when McKenna knew his operation had succeeded came at 0847 hours, when German communication traffic showed unmistakable signs of systematic breakdown rather than isolated equipment problems. Instead of isolated reports of communication difficulties, German operators were reporting widespread system failures that suggested fundamental problems with their entire communication network. More importantly, the pattern of reported failures exactly matched McKenna's theoretical predictions about how his electrical interference would propagate through the German switching system. McKenna's withdrawal from the farmhouse basement required even greater care than his initial approach, as increased German security activity and the approaching dawn reduced his concealment options while increasing the likelihood of detection. However, his mission was essentially complete, and the growing evidence of German communication system failure provided confirmation that his crazy wire trick had achieved its intended effects. The 3-hour window of systematic German communication degradation would provide Colonel Harrison's forces with the tactical advantage necessary to break the Wehrmacht defensive positions while minimizing civilian casualties. The final phase of Allied tactical operations began at 0900 hours when Harrison's forces launched a coordinated assault on German positions that were now operating without effective communication coordination. The attack plan specifically exploited the communication vulnerabilities that McKenna had created, targeting German positions in sequence to maximize the confusion created by their inability to coordinate defensive responses. Allied artillery fire was carefully controlled to avoid civilian areas while targeting German communication installations and command posts that could no longer effectively direct defensive fires. The success of Harrison's assault exceeded all expectations, as German defensive positions that had appeared impregnable 12 hours earlier collapsed rapidly when deprived of the communication coordination that made their tactical scheme effective. Wehrmacht units found themselves fighting isolated actions without the mutual support and coordinated fires that had made their defensive positions so formidable. Within 6 hours, organized German resistance in Malmedy had collapsed, and civilian evacuation operations were proceeding safely under Allied protection. Witness reactions from fellow soldiers who observed McKenna's return to Allied lines ranged from amazement to disbelief that a single soldier's technical expertise could achieve such dramatic tactical results. Captain Hendricks, who had supported McKenna's operation despite his own skepticism, later wrote in his after-action report that Sergeant McKenna's innovative approach to communication warfare achieved results that could not have been accomplished through conventional military means, regardless of the forces employed. The tactical intelligence gathered during McKenna's mission also provided valuable insights into German communication procedures and vulnerabilities that would prove useful in subsequent operations. Colonel Harrison's immediate response to the success of McKenna's operation was to recommend him for the Distinguished Service Cross while simultaneously requesting that higher headquarters investigate whether similar techniques could be applied in other tactical situations where conventional military approaches had proven inadequate. Harrison's recommendation specifically noted that McKenna's civilian electrical expertise had enabled him to identify and exploit vulnerabilities that would have been invisible to personnel with purely military technical backgrounds. The after-action assessment of McKenna's operation revealed that his electrical sabotage had disrupted German communications for over 4 hours, during which time Wehrmacht forces were unable to coordinate artillery fires, maneuver units effectively, or communicate with higher headquarters about their tactical situation. This communication breakdown had directly enabled the successful Allied assault while preventing German forces from implementing their planned destruction of civilian areas and facilities. Intelligence estimates suggested that McKenna's technical innovation had saved the lives of approximately 3,000 Belgian civilians who would otherwise have been killed during German withdrawal operations. The immediate recognition of McKenna's achievement included his promotion to staff sergeant and assignment to divisional headquarters, where his technical expertise could be applied to analyzing German communication procedures and developing countermeasures for similar situations. However, McKenna's response to this recognition was characteristically modest, emphasizing that his success had depended on the support and courage of fellow soldiers rather than individual technical achievement. His written report on the operation focused primarily on technical details and lessons learned rather than personal heroics or dramatic combat action. The technique McKenna had pioneered spread rapidly through Allied forces as word of his success reached other units facing similar tactical challenges. Within weeks, Signal Corps personnel were receiving training in the electrical analysis techniques McKenna had developed, while special teams were being formed to conduct communication sabotage operations based on his methods. The official military adoption of his innovations required significant modifications to existing doctrine and training programs, as few military personnel possessed the civilian electrical background necessary to implement McKenna's techniques without extensive additional education. McKenna's post-war life reflected his preference for practical work and modest recognition over fame or public attention. Following his discharge from the Army in December 1945, he returned to New York and rejoined Local 3 of the Electrical Workers Union, spending the remainder of his career working on the same types of construction projects he had been involved with before the war. He married his longtime girlfriend, Patricia O'Sullivan, in June 1946, and the couple raised 4 children in the same Queens neighborhood where McKenna had grown up learning electrical skills from his father. McKenna rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, even with family members, preferring to focus on the present rather than dwell on past achievements. However, he maintained correspondence with several of his former comrades, including Captain Hendricks, who became a lifelong friend and occasional collaborator on electrical engineering projects during Hendricks' post-war career in the defense industry. These relationships provided McKenna with ongoing connections to the military community while allowing him to maintain his preference for civilian life and practical work over military service or defense contracting. The final years of McKenna's life were spent in comfortable retirement in Queens, where he continued to assist Local 3 with complex electrical troubleshooting problems that challenged younger electricians without his extensive experience with older electrical systems. He died peacefully in his sleep on March 15, 1987, at the age of 69, having lived to see his children and grandchildren established in successful careers while maintaining the modest lifestyle and practical values that had characterized his entire adult life. McKenna's memorial service at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Queens was attended by over 500 people, including surviving members of his military unit, fellow electrical workers from throughout the New York area, and representatives from the Belgian government who had traveled specifically to honor his contribution to their country's liberation. The service emphasized McKenna's lifelong commitment to practical service rather than personal recognition, reflecting values that had guided his approach to both military service and civilian career throughout his adult life. McKenna is remembered today through several permanent memorials and educational programs that honor his innovative approach to military problem-solving while promoting the value of civilian technical expertise in national defense applications. The Thomas McKenna Memorial Scholarship provides financial assistance to young people pursuing electrical engineering education, while the McKenna Institute for Military Innovation studies ways that civilian technical expertise can enhance military effectiveness in contemporary security challenges. Modern military applications of McKenna's communication sabotage techniques have evolved significantly with advances in electronic technology, but the fundamental principles he pioneered continue to influence military communication warfare doctrine throughout NATO countries. Electronic warfare specialists study McKenna's methods as examples of how individual technical expertise can achieve strategic results when applied with proper understanding of enemy vulnerabilities and tactical requirements. His innovations are taught today at the Army Signal School, the Naval War College, and specialized training programs for military communication specialists. The physical memorial to McKenna's achievement consists of a bronze plaque installed in the rebuilt town square of Malmedy, Belgium, which commemorates his role in saving civilian lives during the 1944 liberation. The inscription, written in English, French, and Flemish, reads, "In memory of Staff Sergeant Thomas F. McKenna, United States Army, whose technical skill and personal courage saved 3,000 civilian lives during the liberation of this town, August 16, 1944. Innovation in service of humanity." The ultimate lesson from McKenna's story extends beyond military history to encompass broader questions about the value of individual expertise, creative problem-solving, and the willingness to attempt seemingly impossible solutions when conventional approaches prove inadequate. His success demonstrated that sophisticated military problems sometimes require unconventional solutions drawn from civilian experience and technical knowledge that may not be immediately obvious to traditional military planners. McKenna's achievement also illustrates the importance of supporting individual initiative and creative thinking within military organizations that necessarily emphasize standardized procedures and hierarchical command structures. His commanding officers' willingness to support his unconventional approach, despite their own skepticism about its prospects for success, proved crucial to the operation's ultimate effectiveness and provides a model for integrating individual innovation within military institutional frameworks. The final accounting of McKenna's crazy wire trick encompasses numbers that speak to both its immediate tactical impact and its broader historical significance. 3,000 Belgian civilians lived to see the liberation of their town rather than dying during German withdrawal operations. 4,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were prevented from implementing a tactical plan that would have prolonged the war and increased casualties on both sides. The techniques McKenna pioneered were subsequently applied in 17 other operations during the final months of the European War, contributing to Allied victories that shortened the conflict and reduced overall casualties among both military forces and civilian populations. Perhaps most importantly, McKenna's story demonstrates that technical innovation and creative problem-solving can emerge from unexpected sources when individuals with appropriate expertise are given opportunities to contribute their knowledge to solving critical problems. His success required not only technical skill and personal courage but also institutional support.